You cannot look at women's emancipation outside of the context of economic inequality. In societies where inequality has been reduced, women have more gender equality with men. They're able to make more independent decisions about their own lives.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Equals, the world's greatest podcast about inequality. I'm Max.
And I'm Grazielli. Welcome to Equals.
Yeah, we don't have time for any jokes because this interview is amazing. And so we didn't want to cut it. So we need to get straight into it, don't we?
Yes, let's be really fast. And it is such a gift to have this interview during the International Women's Day, or should we say week, since it was just a few days ago. And we're going to have as a guest Kristen Ghodsee, who is an American professor and author of amazing books, award-winning, and probably the most famous one is Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism.
I think that's got to be the best title for any book ever, hasn't it, really? Cool. Right, let's get into it.
Yes, let's go.
Kristen, it's so great to have you here on Equals. Thanks so much for joining us. You've had an amazing career writing on all sorts of subjects, from women's activism during the Cold War to more modern day things like the manosphere and the disenfranchisement of men. How would you characterize your area of interest? And can you tell our listeners how you got here?
Yeah, so thanks so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I would characterize my work as really looking at the development of global women's rights from a comparative social scientific perspective. So that means I also look at kind of gender relations more broadly and issues of equality and inequality. The way I got here is a really kind of interesting sort of story that I never really thought that much about before, but I was 13 when Sally Ride became the first American woman in space. And I was really excited because I also had some sort of aspirations to be an astronaut. And this was in 1983, and there weren't a lot of role models for girls. But then I found out that the first woman in space was a Russian woman named Valentina Tereshkova, who had actually gone to space in 1963, 20 years before the Americans had put a woman up there. And that just shocked me. I was like, wait, what? And so from a very young age, I became really fascinated with the Eastern Bloc countries. And I was 19 when the Berlin Wall fell. And in the summer of 1990, so that would have been about May, I traveled through Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and what was then Eastern Germany. I was actually on Alexanderplatz in 1990 when the currencies reunified on June 30th, the eve of that event. And so I had a long interest in looking at the experiences of ordinary people who lived under socialism and what happened to particularly women's rights and gender relations after socialism ended. So I've spent the last 28 years of my career looking at the ways that economic systems, particularly capitalism and socialism, differently impact people's ordinary lives.
I find that so interesting. I remember that I had this moment in my life that I had the desire to be an astronaut, but it really seemed so far away. So it's interesting to hear you had that too. And in one of your most famous books, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, excellent title by the way, you explore how capitalism is bad for women. Could you give us some real-time examples of this?
Yeah, sure. So again, this book really emerges out of much of the research that I had been doing. The book came out in 2018, and I was really thinking about what happened to women's rights after the advent of capitalism. And so I could do what social scientists call like a natural experiment, looking at women that had been born and raised on one side of the Iron Curtain compared to women on the other side at a similar period of time and from similar cultural backgrounds. So Germany was a great case study here. So very specifically, I found lots of really interesting things by comparing women East and West. But one of the things that is really important when we think about the inequality between men and women is this concept of statistical discrimination. And what that means is in capitalism, under capitalist economic systems, price of labor is determined by supply and demand. Very simply, that means if there are lots of workers, the price of labor is low. If there are few workers, the price of labor is high. But wages also index quality and reliability. And so what that means is if there is a certain category of workers that are more likely to leave the labor force, who are less reliable, the market is going to adjust for those workers that are less reliable by paying them less. Because why would you hire a worker who is less reliable unless you can actually pay them less? And what that means is that in societies, particularly capitalist societies, where women have primary caregiving responsibilities in the home, they're more likely to have to leave the labor force. And since women are more likely to leave the labor force, employers look at women and say, if I hire this person, it's likely that she will be less reliable, and so I'm going to pay her a little bit less. And what that means is, again, when you have a heterosexual couple, if that couple is having a hard time finding childcare, or there are elder care responsibilities, or there are care responsibilities in the home, that couple is going to rationally decide that the person who makes the lower wage should be the one to stay home so that the person who makes the higher wage can continue in the labor market. And if it always happens to be women who are withdrawing, then that means that women are always going to be the ones with the lower wages. And so heterosexual couples will always choose that the woman stays home. And what you can see is that this is a vicious cycle. Capitalism perpetuates structural gender inequality because it penalizes people with primary caregiving responsibilities, and because free labor markets, where prices for labor are determined by supply and demand, are always going to build in this reliability factor. And markets simply can't correct for this. You need to have state intervention, which is why women under socialism did so much better in terms of their own economic independence and their ability to combine work and family. They were de facto much more equal members of their society with men than in the capitalist countries of the West at a similar period of time.
So tell us a bit more about that then, because I'm always astounded how little comparative work there is between East and West, and that's why your work stands out, and the work of others like Branko Milanovic. And so tell us, maybe just for listeners, just how much better was it for women under socialism, and what were the pluses? And obviously it wasn't perfect, but just paint a picture of what it was like.
Yeah, and I think, it's very important, of course, to not look back through rose-tinted glasses. There were lots of problems with these regimes in 20th century Eastern Europe. But I think it's very important to understand that socialists came to power in 1917 with a very solid platform to achieve women's emancipation. And that meant that women got the right to vote. I mean, they actually got that right before the revolution, but they were fully enfranchised to stand for office, to participate in government. One of the first commissars of social welfare was a woman, Alexandra Kollontai, who had a very, very important role to play in socializing the work that had previously been done in the individual nuclear family. So under Kollontai, women had access to creches and kindergartens. They had job-protected paid parental leaves. They had access to all sorts of resources that supported their domestic work. So public cafeterias, canteens, public laundries, public transportation that allowed women to enter the labor force in a massive way, especially compared to comparable countries in the West at that time. Studies have been done to show that girls who were raised in socialist countries have less of a math achievement gap with boys than girls who were raised in capitalist countries. And so even today, in 2026, I can look at data from the 2022 micro census in Germany and see that there are lingering differences even 35 years after the Berlin Wall fell. The rate of childlessness is much higher in the Western states than it is in the Eastern states, the states that used to be socialist, because women in the East have a much easier time, even still today, combining work and family because of the legacies of socialism. If you look across Eastern Europe and you look at the rates of women working in technology, the rates of women who are in medicine or in science, even today, they are much higher than the European Union average because of the legacies of socialism. So this comparative perspective really teaches us a lot about how narratives of equality, giving girls and young women opportunities for education and training, really, really pays off in the long run, precisely because they have role models in their mothers and grandmothers. I have a Russian friend here in Berlin whose grandmother was a Soviet engineer in the 30s, actually had a PhD in physics at a time when universities in my country of the United States, big universities like Harvard and Princeton and Yale, didn't even allow women to attend.
That's astounding. I think Lenin himself was quite vocal on this kind of thing as well, wasn't he, if I remember rightly?
Absolutely. Lenin, said that housework was mindless drudgery, and he wanted to liberate women from this reproductive labor that is done in the home that was a waste. Like, women's intellectual capacities were profoundly wasted. And it's really interesting because this comparative perspective from a historical point of view, I've written a book looking at the Cold War and the way that narratives at the United Nations about women's rights and superpower rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States really catalyzed women's rights globally. So in 1975, the UN declared the International Year of Women, which then became the International Decade for Women between 1976 and 1985. And there were these three huge global conferences. And this was an incredibly productive time for women's rights because the Eastern Bloc countries really made the Western countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and France look bad. They looked terrible in terms of the way they treated their women compared to those in the East. And so these Eastern Bloc women who were at the United Nations and within the whole UN system and doing this international global kind of activism around women's rights really catalyzed change in a way that we seldom appreciate today. I think a lot of people in the West have this fantasy that global women's rights were achieved by the suffragettes or by second wave women's activists, burning their bras and marching on the streets in the late 60s and 70s. And that's just not true. So much of what happened because of East-West rivalry between the capitalist world and the socialist world during the Cold War.
That's really interesting. It's amazing the perspective that you bring. And I'm just wondering here, this book was published around 8 years ago, so let's say a decade ago. What has changed in the time that you published this book and now regarding women and men? And I'm considering especially one specific scenario about something that the United Nations just came out these days, saying that violence against women is now a global emergency. How do you see the evolving context that we are living?
Okay, and this is really, I think, one of the most important points that I need to make, and I am writing about like right now, and I've been thinking hard. The relationship between the manosphere and what we call toxic masculinity, domestic violence against women, hatred and misogyny online, and the rise of trad wife discourses. So this idea that women should go home and, cook and clean and churn butter and bake bread and be with their children and not in the labor force. And all of this is happening at a moment when we are going to experience an exogenous employment shock because of artificial intelligence. So let me unpack this because this is a really important point and it's very relevant to the violence against women and the online misogyny that women and girls are experiencing right now. Historically, in capitalist societies, women have been a reserve army of labor. So the classic example of this in the West is in Britain and in the United States. During the Second World War, when the boys were shipped off to the front, women were mobilized into the labor force. As soon as those boys came home from fighting, the women got shoved back into the home. This was true in many West European countries as well. And I think if we look at the experience of Eastern Europe, Eastern European women were incredibly emancipated. They had some of the highest labor force participation rates in the world in the 1980s. And after the collapse of socialism and the creation of free market economies in Eastern Europe, women were shoved back into the home. They were shoved out of the labor force because there was an exogenous shock to the economy. In this case, the introduction of capitalism, which completely restructured the labor market from a socialist labor market, which had guaranteed employment employment to a private, competitive, capitalist labor market where women were going to be discriminated against because, as I mentioned, this factor of statistical discrimination. But now we're in a moment where AI, artificial intelligence, is about to decimate an incredible swath of white collar employment. Everybody is talking about this. And so economists and political leaders and policymakers understand that we're about to experience a huge exogenous shock to the economy, which is going to reduce employment. It's going to increase unemployment, probably to socially unstable levels. And so the playbook has always been to push women back into the home. And that means challenging women's rights, overturning women's reproductive freedoms, challenging women's ability to get education, to get professional training, making the world a hostile, unpleasant place for women so that they don't want to go out into the public sphere. I think if we really think about what's going on in the world today, women have to understand that there is a structural change that is coming in the economy, and they are going to be the collateral damage. The way that states are going to deal with this is the way that states have always dealt with this, which is by putting women back in the kitchen to take care of the children. And there's a concomitant discussion online about birth rates. A lot of European countries, a lot of countries in the global south are talking about birth rates. And so again, this fear that, Western civilization is dying because selfish women don't want to have babies is precisely the kind of narrative that will justify pushing women out of the labor force and back into the home.
Wow. Let me ask you a question in the other direction. So, we also saw during the kind of 60s, 70s in the West, massive entry of women to the labour market. And that was also at the time, I remember I kind of argued that, it was driving down the power of labour over capital.
Yes.
Driving down the power of men, working men, to negotiate in the same way outsourcing jobs to China was. So in that sense, there was an interest on the part of capital to have more women in the workforce. So how would that square with, how does that connect with now being in a position where it's in the interests of to push women out?
Exactly. I think, there's been wonderful work by my colleague, Nancy Fraser, who talks about precisely how capital co-opted the women's movement for its own purposes. She calls capitalism and feminism strange bedfellows, because precisely at a moment when organized labor was weak and when capitalism felt that patriarchy was actually a hindrance to its further expansion, there was this desire to flood the market with this excess labor. Now, of course, women had been fighting for these rights for quite a long time. And, again, this is why capitalism is part of the issue here, because labor markets treat people's time and energy as a commodity to be bought and sold with prices determined by supply and demand. And so countries which regulate their labor markets much more strictly are going to create the conditions for higher levels of equality for both men and women. Men's lives will also be improved by greater levels of regulation or more democratic forms of economy.
And by the time that this podcast goes on air, we will be celebrating the International Women's Day, or let's say week. In view of all the challenges you have highlighted facing women and girls in this episode, how do you think we can raise a generation of young women as fearless as they are compassionate and ready to face these challenges head on?
So this is where I'd like to talk about my most recent book, Everyday Utopia, Better Ways of Living Equally, where I really look at concrete examples from the present day, as well as going back 2,500 years historically to try to understand how we could imagine a different future. So International Women's Day, this is actually its 115th anniversary. I'm actually in Germany where that holiday was founded. And in Berlin, it's actually a public holiday. So it's a pretty big deal here. And the idea of this holiday is to challenge the economic structures that drive inequality. So for a lot of feminists, the bogeyman is patriarchy. Men are the enemy. And I think we're living in a moment with both the online manosphere and sort of toxic masculinity and all of the hatred towards women, but there's also women who are retreating into their own kinds of, there's like the 4B movement in Korea where women aren't having babies or getting married. They don't want anything to do with men. And so men and women are being driven apart, especially young girls and young men. We have very, very good data that shows that young men are polarizing to the right and young women are polarizing to the left, and that this makes it very hard for them to date. It makes it very hard for them to even have conversations with each other. And so early socialists, the people who started this holiday in 1911, people like Clara Zetkin in Germany, Alexandra Kollontai in what would eventually become the Soviet Union, they were very aware that in order to challenge unfair economic structures, in order to challenge the power of capital globally, you need men and women to work together. And so I think that too often men on the right blame feminists for X, Y, and Z, for the low birth rate, for driving down wages, for breaking the backs of labor, for all sorts of things. Women blame patriarchy for statistical discrimination, for violence against women. But at the end of the day, behind these social forces, we also have to think of the broader political economy. We have to think about the structures of our economy that perpetuate inequality and exploitation. And it's those things that drive people apart, not just men and women, but also, it increases racism and xenophobia, homophobia, all sorts of discrimination. This is a system that wants to divide people from each other. And so as a social scientist and as somebody interested in historical experiments that have challenged structures of inequality all the way back to Pythagoras is where I start this book, we can consistently see that when people challenge structures of inequality, they do it by creating communities of small egalitarian communities where people share and work together. And that means working together with people that are different than you are. And that means creating coalitions between men and women, between people of different ethnicities, of different religious beliefs, and so on and so forth. And so International Women's Day is not just about women. It's also about creating a world where women and men and everyone participates more equitably in a just and sustainable economic future together, one that allows people to thrive, that puts people above profits, that puts well-being and puts, community above individualism and wealth creation.
I couldn't agree more. Can you see the liberation of women in countries that are economically unequal? Do you think that's possible?
You cannot look at women's emancipation outside of the context of economic inequality. In societies where inequality has been reduced, women have more gender equality with men. They're able to make more independent decisions about their own lives. The minute the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and you had this rush to embrace free market capitalism, which resulted in massive increases in inequality in Eastern Europe. I mean, Russia would be the perfect example of a country that had relatively low levels of inequality and then massive amounts of inequality as you saw a few oligarchs take control of vast amounts of the wealth of the Soviet Union. Immediately, you begin to see women making a choice, for instance, to get breast implants rather than going to university, because the breast implants are going to allow them to land a more wealthy man than going to university where they're just going to get a job at some bad wage. You see massive increases in, sex trafficking out of Eastern Europe. You see all sorts of structural discrimination that emerges against women that didn't exist prior to the 1990s. And so if you want a case study to show how inequality is directly related to women's rights, The East-West comparison clearly shows that you cannot uncouple these two things from each other. And I think that in Everyday Utopia, I actually put forward a theory of why patriarchy thrives in countries or scenarios with high levels of inequality. In highly unequal societies, you have this tendency for a few men at the very, very top of the hierarchy to hoard resources, which also means hoarding women. And that disenfranchises a huge group of what are called surplus bachelors. A large population of bachelors, historically speaking, can create instability in a system because they have very little to lose if they challenge the authority of men in power. And so one of the things that happened, particularly in the European context, was socially imposed universal monogamy that allowed every man to have a wife by prohibiting elite men from having more than one. And so that meant that even though men were disenfranchised, they still had their own kind of little hierarchy within the home where they were the master of their children and their wives. This comes from Roman law, this idea that the strong father figure is the basis of society. In Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, in fact, Hobbes asks, like, how do you train people to obey the sovereign? Well, you train people to obey the sovereign by having a strong father figure in the house, because if children are raised to obey their father, then those children understand obedience to a sovereign. Like it's an essential component of totalitarianism. And so it's not a surprise to me at all that in a moment when we are experiencing a kind of resurgence of authoritarian rule across the world, we are also seeing a resurgence in misogyny and a desire to control women and put them back into the home.
So we need to reduce inequality, to reduce violence against women. That's really, really insightful. And we always try to end with like a hope message. And you said that people challenge inequality by creating communities. In this book, this latest book, do you have concrete examples of these communities that could be like a lesson for those who are willing to start those?
Yeah, I have many examples, actually. One of my favorite examples is the eco-village Nashira in southern Colombia. It is a matriarchal eco-village that is run by women for women, and it's existed now for over 18 years. It's an incredible inspiration for many people organizing around the world, particularly around the idea of a maternal gift economy, which is kind of an alternative economics idea about how to organize reciprocal exchanges in a future beyond capitalism. But everywhere you look in Europe, in the global South, you have these wonderful experimental communities that are really challenging inequality by redesigning their everyday lives. That's why the book is called Everyday Utopia. And I think one of the most exciting things for me is to see people dreaming of what the world could be like in the future, what a better world could be like, and not just dreaming about it, but actually trying to build those worlds here and now today. And so as we try to build a more equitable future for everyone, we have to be willing to think outside the proverbial box and to think more creatively about the way they could be in the future.
Truly inspiring. Thank you very much, Kristen. What a fabulous interview. Is there anything you want to say that you feel you haven't?
The one thing that I should have said earlier is that these women who founded International Women's Day, they understood that a women's movement could not only be about a small group of elite women getting access to property and to the professions and to education, that a real women's movement had to have class solidarity, not only with working class women, but also with working class men. It wasn't about making women #girl bosses, but the idea of a more material women's movement, a more sort of socialistic vision of a women's movement, is that the material conditions of life for everyone improves rather than for a few women who rise to the top. You can have Margaret Thatcher be the prime minister and still preside over an incredibly unequal economy. And so International Women's Day represents a kind of women's movement which is hoping to build a more equitable future for everyone.
Great. Thank you. Thanks a million.
Thank you so much.
Whoa, this was an impacting interview because lots of what she has said It's something that we feel in our daily lives as women. We can feel, we can see how society is changing, the anger against women, the amount of feminicide and of violence against women that's increasing so much. It's so scary. But when she puts everything in such an organized way and bringing a perspective that this is all related to the economic system, it's really, really scary. It does feel like a prison.
Yeah, I agree, Grace. In the last podcast, we talked to Zoe and Sharon about, how minorities and migrants and racism is used to scapegoat and the powerful and the rich force people to be hating others rather than being angry about the system. And you could say that about misogyny too, that, hatred of women, the rise in misogyny is, again, a form of scapegoating, a form of distraction from the economic system and a recognition of where the real problem is. But she was doing a lot more than that. She was basically saying that, it's deliberate because the economic system requires at this point in history that women are forced back into the home. And that's why it's happening. And that really blew my mind.
Absolutely. It's like when we had the Industrial Revolution, for the economic system, it was good to have women on the working force because they needed that, people working 24 hours a day. But now with AI and the 4.0 revolution, they don't need that anymore. They now need women back to their homes. It's as if women were toys of the economic system.
Yeah, exactly. Really, really amazing interview. I hope you all enjoyed that as much as we did. Really fantastic. Please stay tuned into Equals. We've got lots of other amazing episodes coming up soon. We're going to find out about inequality in Norway soon, aren't we? Which is going to be amazing. But yeah, stay tuned and find us on www.equals.ink. So talk to you all next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Speak soon. Bye-bye.